Awesome. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. As Alicia mentioned, my name is Omari Burnside, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Strategy and Practice here at NASPA. I again want to formally welcome you all here today for our virtual highlight session, all about advising. I know people have a lot of things going on right now, so we really just appreciate you being here and joining us here today. So I am part of NASPA's research and policy team, where I have the privilege of working with a number of institutions as well as national organizations who are just doing great work to increase and foster a culture of student success at campuses all across the US. And so one of the areas that NASPA has been doing a deep dive in the last year and a half or so has been advising. And so we have been partnering and collaborating with organizations to just learn more about the current state of advising, hearing how things are working. But secondly, we're working to identify some of the most critical needs institutions are facing when they're going through advising redesign. And so that brings us here today, where I have 5 who will be sharing some great insights with you today. I want to let them introduce themselves in a moment. You see them on your screen and on video, but we're going to start with Jennifer Keup here, and then we're going to move our way down the line.
Thanks, Omari. I'll also do a sound check. Can you all do a thumbs up if you can hear me, my panelists? Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Keup, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience in Students in Transition. And yes, we really do need an acronym, but we also need to buy a vowel or something because we can't quite figure out that. We are a center located at the University of South Carolina, and we're really born out of the success of the first year experience and first year seminar movement at University of South Carolina, but quickly spread to a vision that went well beyond one institution and well beyond one initiative. So the National Resource Center was founded in the 80s, and we have been working for decades now with a focus on supporting and advancing efforts to improve student learning and transitions into and through higher education. And what that really means is we are focused on student success with a particular emphasis, though, on those critical junctures, those forks in the educational road where students really are dealing with a transition, whether it be high school to college, 2-year to 4-year, first year to second year of the institution, or putting a bow on their experience and looking to their culminating experience into the world of work or graduate school and professional school and life beyond their undergraduate experience. That said, there are a number of different transitions, though, that go far beyond just any kind of one singular moment of a temporal thing. We have students changing majors, we have students changing identities, we have students changing in their relationships, all sorts of different elements of that, and all those changes fall under the umbrella of the work that we do. And all those changes really are moments, and those critical junctions are moments where advising and advisors become a support structure to the holistic development of students. And I think that really speaks to our place in this conversation. Our work is done through conferences and continuing education, a full line of publications, a full line of social media and communication channels, as well as original research and thought leadership. So I think that's a little bit about us.
Thanks, Jennifer. Turn it over to Jackie.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacquelyn Jones, and I'm the Senior Director of the Frontier Set and Student Success Strategy at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. So we are an association that serves mainly presidents and provosts. We do a lot of convening with those colleagues, and we are focused on really supporting the regional comprehensive institutions and looking toward policy. We look toward leadership, different things like that. So I'll just leave it at that, and then we'll go into our next colleague here.
Okay, thanks, Jacquelyn. Chris?
Okay, good morning. My name is Chris Hutt. I'm the project director for the Advising Success Network at NACADA. NACADA used to be an acronym for something, but now it's just the global community for academic advising. This year we're celebrating our 40th year in existence, and NACADA has served primarily frontline academic advisors, advising administrators, look at the difference between faculty and professional staff. We recently developed a fairly robust research arm, but it's an organization supporting academic advising globally.
All right, thanks, Chris. Kathe?
Hello, everybody. I'm Kathe Pelletier, and I'm the Director for Student Success Community Programs at EDUCAUSE. And EDUCAUSE is an organization that includes IT professionals, higher ed leaders, corporate members, nonprofit members, and we're really focused through elevating the impact of IT in higher ed. And this really is a conversation not just with the folks who work directly in IT, but across campuses for a truly integrative strategic approach. We have about 2,300 organizational members, again, spanning higher ed campuses to nonprofit members to corporate thought leaders that are working in both in technology delivery and service delivery as well. Happy to be here with you today.
Thanks, Kathe. Last but not least, Shauna.
Yes, good morning. I am Shauna Davis, the Executive Director of Holistic Student Supports at Achieving the Dream. And Achieving the Dream is an organization, a nonprofit organization that leads a growing network of more than 277 community colleges committed to helping their students achieve their goals for academic success, personal growth, and economic opportunity. We work closely with colleges in our network to help them build their capacity, and our network spans 44 states and the District of Columbia with a reach of more than 4 million community college students who are served by those institutions.
All right, thank you. And again, big thanks to our panelists joining us from the pleasures of their homes right now. And so big thanks for just taking the time out to talk with us today. As you all can see, we have a good lineup for you all today. We believe that the folks and the organizations represented on this webinar right now are really well positioned to help us just understand the entire advising ecosystem, right? From understanding the student experience to the role of leadership and advising professionals to having the proper infrastructure in place. And we were saying infrastructure, the structure, the processes, the technology that's needed to really successfully have a comprehensive and holistic student support system. And so some of the questions that our panelists today will be helping us to uncover and address are what you see on the screen right now. When we're talking about the friction points in advising, we just talked about the structures, the processes, the technology. It takes a lot to get all of those pieces on one accord. And so really want to talk a little bit more about where are some of the biggest pain points that we see institutions have in this space. Another thing about advising, where we're saying, you know, where do some of the inequities in advising exist? We really want to make sure that all students at an institution are having a solid advising experience. And so how can we be a little more proactive in thinking through how to make that experience for all students? We can't have this conversation without saying what's the role of faculty in this conversation. So really interested to hear their insights around this. But also some of the things that we hear, you know, when people say you're doing advising, we have a lot of common questions, right? So what's the proper advisor to advising ratio? What's the right technology? And these questions are important, right? But we also want to elevate the conversation a little bit, right? And so to have those conversations, say, you know, how can we have greater alignment with advising? How does it really fit into the overall working of the institution, and just put a little bit more greater intentionality behind it that we know many institutions are doing. And then last but not least, but what is the role of leadership in really moving this agenda and really prioritizing advising as part of the effort of the institution? And so with that, let me pause first. First, for the purpose of this conversation, right, advising can mean a lot of things. And so we have worked together to say for our work, we are defining advising as this. And so I'm going to read it word for word, sorry, but I feel like we spent a lot of time on it to make these words right. So we're going to go through it. So one, when we're saying advising is a critical component of student success and a bright star in the integrated constellation of student support services at an institution. The advisor-advisee relationship supports students as they identify and attain their academic, career, and personal goals. And underneath that, we know there's so many components. So really, one, getting clear about the roles and responsibilities of the primary role advisor and faculty advisors. What does that student interaction look like with various entities across the campus? What is advising pedagogy? Using advising as teaching and learning. The different approaches and models that can encompass into an advising system, and then the overall structure and operations there. And so we're going to hear from our panelists. And so they prepare, they know the questions before them, but please feel free if you have any questions to put it in the chat box and things like that. But we're going to start with Jennifer. Let's go here. I'm going to start with Jennifer. And so Jennifer, I'm going to pose this first question. So when I just went over our definition of advising, we said it's a bright star in a constellation of student support, right? And so really want to get your thoughts saying, what role does advising play in this constellation of student support services? And just how have you seen it, or how has the field changed over time as it relates to this?
Thank you, Omari. It's always sort of daunting to get started because I imagine many of you in the audience of this particular session are advisors, or this is intimately connected. So I'm sure that many of you could probably answer this question better than I can, but I'm going to try to do you and your work justice a little here. The National Resource Center does several national surveys of various programming. And what we have found from the responses to those surveys on an institutional level is that academic advising is the most commonly utilized tool in both an organized and integrated first-year experience effort, as well as an organized and integrated sophomore year initiative. It is by far and away the most significant initiative in the second year, and it is one of the top 4 initiatives, the first of 4 initiatives that are the most common and really the pillars of a first-year experience at most institutions. We also have seen that advising shows up later in the undergraduate experience through our national survey of culminating in capstone experiences in the senior year, although it looks a little different. Supervised practice, undergraduate research. Typically, we see a lot more kind of internship, apprenticeship-based advising in that space, as well as advising students into career planning and launch. But throughout the undergraduate experience, our data are showing that advising is a critical component of our approach to student success. But what that looks like, as we know, has changed over time. And I think anybody would sit in an elevator speech, from floor 1 to floor 20, for somebody who maybe is generally familiar with higher education, and they would understand that historically the kinds of roles have been, the fact that you have academic planning, course selection, some transactional elements that are really embedded in the advising relationship, and historically have been there for quite some time. I think, though, that there's other elements that have long been overlooked historically. The idea that advising is really an introduction to what that relationship is and how it's different than high school counseling. The partnership that's embedded in that relationship between student advisor and that person being an advocate for the undergraduate in that experience. Again, major exploration, charting career pathways, navigating in many ways the myriad bureaucratic elements that go along with being a student, and how do I select courses and change majors and interact with my department. Those are all critical as well, and have been long-standing understood pieces of it. And again, forging that connection with the student and establishing a relationship. An advisor is usually one of the first individuals that a student interacts with once they have begun instruction, once they have committed and are engaged in that audience. But we all know that also there's been an evolution of responsibilities too. The idea that a student changing majors is just checking a box or filling out a form, we all know is ridiculous, right? I mean, a student who is going through a major exploration and selection is also going through an incredible amount of identity exploration and redefinition. It may include family dynamics as well, because the student might have come in wanting to do something for their family or for the expectations of their community. It might have to do with dealing with failure and resilience, that the first path didn't work out that way and they're going to something else. There's skill and competency development that goes into all aspects of course selection and major selection and exploration and all that element. And really, even if it's transactional in nature, there's a lot of skill development that goes into communicating effectively, being able to understand, elements and choices and quantitative literacy around all the elements of that. Advising really has become an incredible stewardship of financial investment in college. Certainly balancing exploration and the appropriate placement of a student academically is critical, but also helping a student understand that that has financial implications, and what to do with that has been a key portion of how advising has evolved. And particularly that, I think, has elements of the equity perspective, right? That students aren't making choices that they can't afford to make, and therefore putting themselves in a bad situation, and really managing things from a proactive perspective and helping the student feel empowered. Mentorship, student success and tracking and early alerts, and the connection that advisors have as a key node in a lot of different elements of the undergraduate experience, particularly in the first and second years. But truth be told, the fact of the matter is that we are still seeing that even though advising is common, and even though we see that it's a common tool and the elements are evolving over time, the challenge is that still is sort of a one-off on its own. It's not as integrated into that constellation. So we use data to actually map what a constellation of the first year experience looked like. And certainly while advising was the brightest star, it was completely outside the constellation. It wasn't practically or statistically connected to the rest of the elements in a first year experience. And so there's a lot of potential still to be gained in advising in terms of integrating it and bringing it into a position of more centrality in our approaches, rather than just being sort of a place of referential, liminal kind of potential. There's also great potential, I think, in looking at, and from what I've seen in the literature about looking at the next stages of advising, that it's a critical node in the network of campus resources. It is often in that liminal space between academic and student affairs and student support. And there's power in that. There's power in building that bridge for the students and the campus community in that liminal space. There are purveyor about messages that it's just not about retention, that it's about a full holistic student experience, both to the student and to the campus community, that there's a whole student here. We have to have a wraparound perspective of that. It's an incredible tool for equity, and I recently heard Sean Harper talk about the fact that we need better spaces to hear our students' stories, particularly students who have been historically underrepresented or marginalized. And academic advising is a critical place to hear students' stories, to give them voice. It's also a critical place to bring to light students who are historically in invisible populations, foster youth, low-income students, students who are from religious minorities, students who have housing and food insecurity. There are a number of identity areas that we do not capture well, and we can't assume, and advising is a space where those really come out. So there's a lot there to then elevate advising to really being the next emergent high-impact practice. And I think I'm just about over my 6 minutes, so I'm going to stop right there and set it up for my colleagues going next.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. I think I think you laid out the commercial, the moral imperative for advising, and just talking about just how critical and important it is from how advisors make those critical connections with the students, from making sure that we're understanding the journey that students take, and how we can align advising in that way to just leave room for that space for exploration. But also, recognizing that there is a need to integrate some of these pieces, but also finding ways and opportunities to leverage, I would say, the power of advising for the betterment of the institution, right? So one, how can you hear the front line from the advisors that have those connections with the students to hear and capture those stories, but also understanding that when you have academic affairs, student affairs, there's a good bridge there, and so being able to do that. So I think that's a good segue to our next colleague, good old Jacquelyn Jones, who is going to share a little bit of information. And so my question for Jackie, like I said, Jennifer laid out a very good pathway to say, like, this is how advising has evolved and what we can do with advising. So I want to get a sense from you to say that, as institutions are creating these advising experience, how are institutions making sure that they're targeted, relevant, and culturally responsive in that way?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Omari. This question definitely resonates with me because I do believe that it's the goal of institutions to create experiences for our students that are targeted to meet their needs, that are relevant to meet the student where they are, and generally culturally responsive. So in this context, I'd like to think about it and take it from the lens of thinking about advising across race at institutions, and knowing that our institutions make every attempt to provide a culturally sensitive advising experience to meet the students of their target population. So when we think about the system of academic advising and how it's used across institutions in higher education, we know that it is done to promote the holistic development of students as they work towards their academic and their personal and their social endeavors. And we know that academic advisors, they play that key role in ensuring that academic success and overall, they have the overall well-being of their students who they do work with. And more specifically, we think about culturally competent academic advisors and how they serve as that pivotal resource and in support of students, and to serve specifically students of color. And then more broadly thinking about the leadership at our institutions. And I think that they're concerned about the various characteristics of, the approaches to, and the perspectives of academic advising. And I think they're strategically plugged into implications for using culturally sensitive academic advising practices when working with students of color, especially at predominantly white institutions. As institutions increase their attempts to diversify and expand the undergraduate college student population, I think there's a need to increase the academic resources and support services for their students, and thinking about students of color in particular. And because of this, our academic advisors play that essential role in the academic success and the degree completion of their students. The ways in which they advise and perceive their students can impact the way their students navigate and make sense of their college environment. The relationship between faculty advisor and student is just one aspect of the academic advising experience. And I think that establishing the relationship between faculty and advisor and students of color must also learn how their ethnic and racial identities influence the interactions of their larger college experience.
All right, thanks. Really honing in on a point, like really truly understanding your student population and designing an experience that is flexible enough to really address the unique needs of student population. So Jackie has a part two to her question. And so I want to transition. So like, what are some of the institutional context factors into some of the tensions and opportunities for leveraging the greatness that academic advising can bring to the campus?
Sure, thanks, Omari. So I think that it is important to call out context, and the fact that context does matter when we're talking about institutions developing advising practices that do not alienate students. So the idea that while there are general promising practices related to advising, there's no one formula for good advising practice that will address all students in all contexts. So we have to think about the institutional size, the institutional type, the mission of that institution. What's the control of the institution? Is it public? Is it private? Is it the community college sector? Where is that institution located? Is it rural? Is it urban serving? The culture of that institution comes into play, the history, the traditions. So all of this matters to how advising practices are successfully structured to meet the students and the needs of those students. And also, we can't ignore the fact that certain populations of students, whether that's low income, whether that's students of color, first generation, underserved student populations, just to name a few, particularly those that are of interest to the racial and equity agenda of this work, they tend to go to certain types of institutions. And why is that? Because of access and because of sense of belonging. So if this work is really going to be about advancing the student success and racial equity, context matters in that way too. So as an association at ASCU, as I said earlier, we serve mainly presidents and provosts, and we're keenly aware that we represent a particular institutional segment. So we serve the regional comprehensive institutions who do serve that target population of students who are historically first generation, low income, underserved students of color. And so with all that being said, context matters a great deal in colleges and universities. So we're charged with providing an overall good experience for our students, and advising provides that context in which students can discover what's important for them to know, what's important for them to do and value at each stage of their academic development. I think that institutional context matters so much that our entire organization at ASCU, we've committed ourselves to redefining our value proposition in support of context. It's that institutional context of our membership and the students that they serve every single day. So in our student success area, we are fundamentally redesigning how we provide services to our membership and how we meet our members where they are because of who they serve. All of this matters in context because it's done in part due to the intentional work with a group of institutions in our membership who's been pioneering in this space. They've been going deep. They've helped us as an association understand the nuances of how institutional transformation is possible at these institutions. They are the tip of the spear. And so we've learned many lessons from our institutions related to advising redesign and how context matters for leveraging the potential of academic advising and how institutions in this sector are moving the needle on student success and on advising redesign. So what we know is this: we know that these institutions are leading the transformative work in closing those racial and equity gaps. We know that this group of institutions who we've been working with at ASCU are able to pass on the lessons that they've learned to the field, to those institutions, and to the nearly 1 million students whose lives they are standing and ready to transform. So my point of view on context is this: it's critical to making decisions about how we're advancing the work around advising and student success. And because of the deep learning of our institutions, and I don't have time to go into some examples, but because of that learning that we've had the opportunity to be around, we know firsthand the understanding of context mattering for advising redesign, and it must be called out if we are to move the needle.
All right, thanks so much, Jackie. And I think many people, we can try to find a way to highlight some of those examples that you are mentioning, those institutions that are transforming by rethinking, advising, and all those things. All right, so I'm going to transition to Chris. And so what I want Chris to focus on is when we talk about the role of faculty and primary role advisors, what concerns or issues are you seeing as advisors advocate for success for all students?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think that there are, two main things that we can talk about here. One is those issues that are maybe common to most, if not all, students, and then two, as Jackie and Jennifer both referenced, the equity question or issue. And if we start with that, not all students are starting with the same place. Not all have that same background, the family and historical knowledge. We tend to take a pretty deep dive into our own language sometimes, and it's easy to forget that, especially maybe a first-generation student doesn't really understand what we mean when we say credit hour. We have some kind of exclusionist language sometimes. Why do we call it a bursar's office? What does the registrar's office do? And if a student doesn't know those things, where do they go? How do they know how to find those things out? We can say, well, that's on you, and Google is your friend, and you can find those resources. And that's certainly true, but we've got a lot of students that come in either with that knowledge because they're have family members that have gone to college or are part of that system, or maybe a little bit more well connected, more comfortable and confident asking those questions. And so that can present a challenge. Our own institutional structures sometimes are kind of confusing and exclusionary. When our internet goes down, as it probably is a lot for a lot of us these days, more frequently than it has. We call the 800 number. The person we get on the other end of the line isn't the one necessarily the one that created the problem or can solve it. They're going to have to go to the text and on and on. At a large decentralized university, we've got very similar structures. A student calls an academic advisor or a student services expert, thinking that person will be the be-all, end-all, and that's just not the case. And so helping students navigate that and finding the place they need to go is certainly critical, but some students are more able to do that and find that entry point and be comfortable with that entry point than others. We're in interesting times right now. The middle of a global pandemic, all of a sudden everybody's working from home. Faculty are very quickly moving their classes to online modalities. That's a real challenge. I think it's important that we take into consideration that the students might not always have the same resources that we assume that they do or that we do ourselves. It's not always easy to just run down the street and pick up a dual screen monitor set up and up your bandwidth to accommodate your new reality. Certainly we're dealing with that, I think, as faculty and staff. All of a sudden I'm homeschooling 3 children, 2 are kindergarten age, so there's a 50-50 chance that I get through the next 4 minutes without somebody coming in and asking me for some apple juice. Acknowledging those realities, right? I mean, that's important. And as institutions, I think sometimes we can very easily lose sight of that. We want to have, rigorous academic programs. We want to provide students with a quality experience. But sometimes those cumbersome policies can get conflated with academic rigor. And I think we have to be very intentional and very conscious of that, especially in advising. I think academic advising, there's certainly a teaching and learning component to that. There's also a very strong student service component, and recognizing and meeting students where they are in the moment is so critical. Not to just point the finger at institutions, but I think that there are things that we can do to help. There's not a lot of curricular flexibility in some of our programs. So if a student comes in undeclared or misdeclared in an academic program of study, sometimes it can really affect their time to completion and the hours accumulated at the time of completion if they need to make a pivot. Either if they decide or we decide for them, then they're not in the right major. What does that look like, and what services are we providing? What structures do we put in place to make sure that that is a smooth transition? So yeah, I could go on, but I think those are kind of the big ones that we're facing right now, the ones I hope we tackle first.
Awesome, thanks so much. And so this transitions to our first Q&A break, and I'm going to go to Chris first with the question to give him a little chance to catch his breath. But if anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. But our first question is a little bit about just resources available that you've seen. So we had a question that said, what resources or processes are used to help students explore who they are when the student is considering changing majors? So what guidance tools have you seen to help students through that process of selecting a major or guiding them through the major change process?
Sure. Yeah, I've had a good bit of personal experience with this. For about a decade, I was the pre-med guy at a university, and so had a lot of students that came in, and they were going to be doctors because they got the Fisher Price kid at 4, and Grey's Anatomy was their favorite TV show, or whatever the reason was. And then organic chemistry happens, and folks need to pivot sometimes. So, the resources that I think we as advisors employ, and maybe we can employ even more intentionally and earlier, proactively, asking those questions. Well, what is it that led you to believe that this was the right fit for you? Or, using that same example, medicine, why do you want to be a doctor? Well, because I want to help people. Well, there are a lot of different ways to help people. And so let's have a conversation around that. Engineering is another one. It's a very high attrition program. Well, why do you want to be an engineer? Well, because I like fixing things. I like solving problems. Well, what are some other ways that we can do that? Because engineering is essentially an applied math and physics program, and that's what you would be doing professionally as well. Do you like doing math and physics? And if the answer is then yes, then we're probably in a good space. And if not, then let's talk about what other aspects of problem solving, or what is it that draws you to that. On a large campus that has multiple offices, I've encouraged students, look at this from 3 lenses. Talk to your academic advisor who can help you define what the curricular pieces are for these various academic programs, but also take advantage of the fact that a lot of campuses have a dedicated career center. And so approach it from that lens. Also, if a counseling office does any individual career or personal interest counseling, offers assessments through that office, that's another great way to try and get some triangulation. Each of those 3 offices might help shine a light on a third of the answer, but together you can get some consensus sometimes. So encouraging a student to really look broadly at what is it that I think I understand about this profession or this major, and how does that align with who I really am.
Awesome, thanks. Any other thoughts from any other panelists? So I look at the next questions. Oh, Shauna.
Yeah, I would just jump in there. I think this goes along with something that Jackie had mentioned earlier when she was talking about institutional context. And I love what Chris just said about, you know, there's a spectrum of supports and ways in which, but I think one of the other things to keep in mind here is that we have to understand who our students are as they're coming into our institutions, who we serve. So this idea that sometimes our career trajectories, just as many of us, perhaps if we told our own stories, may have started out with influence from family or friends, or from what we thought was a good idea, or just from our own exposure in life. So when you think about when we're asking someone to choose a program of study, a major, whatever terminology we're using on our campuses, and we so often line that up, right, with economic outcomes and career opportunities and those sorts of things, we're asking people to make sense of information around programs or things that they may not have even ever been exposed to. They may not know anyone within their 8 blocks or in their neighborhood or in their community who does X. Now, maybe they do, and that's why they're choosing it. So I am the 3rd generation, you know, whatever, in my family, and so that's why I'm choosing it. But many times when we start to think about the options and what students are choosing, it has a lot to do with, as Chris mentioned, it could be outside influence, it could be aspirational things, but they don't necessarily have an understanding of what the culture of that work entails, of what the day-to-day realities are, as many of us didn't until we started working. So I do think that that is one of the things that we should always keep in mind as institutions look for low-tech and high-tech and personal ways in which to support students, and understanding that for some students, we are asking them to choose what they want to do before they are aware of the possibilities for their life. And it is very hard to make sense of that through a conversation. And so those may be some ways in which we can think about programming or supports based on who we have coming into our institution, to think about ways we can expose students to more possibilities before we have them lock into too deep into a program.
Awesome. Thanks, Shauna. One more question, and then I'm going to bring up our next panelist, Kathe. But we have one question. I believe, Chris, I'm going to give it to you. The question is, how do we strike a balance between providing service and transitioning a student to independent, self-driven, academic, personal, and professional lives?
Yeah, that is consistently a tough balance to strike, and I know over the course of my own career, I've kind of swung from one end of the pendulum on this to the other. I think it's absolutely essential to provide and to model that professional behavior and to demonstrate to a student those things that we hope that they carry with them in their time beyond college. What are the takeaways for them? And so, you know, knowing how to write, how to communicate, as I jokingly said, you know, how to talk to old people. But how do you engage in those professional conversations, and how do you learn to think and act independently? You know, the more we can do for that student in those areas, the more prepared they're going to be. And that kind of, you know, transcends or is the wraparound service that goes along with the classroom experience. And early on in my career, I was really pretty rigid about that. I wanted to make sure that a first contact with a student, you know, was very professional, was you know, perhaps in hindsight maybe a little bit too formal. I would encourage students very early on to come to their own conclusions, do their own research, because I wanted them to be independent thinkers and learners. As I got a little older, I kind of realized, well, if I run somebody off in that first contact, I never have the opportunity for those teachable moments that are so critical. So I would much rather engage a student in a way that keeps them plugged in, even if I'm not modeling my best behavior professionally, so that I have the opportunity down the road to get those moments in. So rather than encouraging a student to do research and find an answer that's pretty easy to find, that first time I might show the value that I bring to the table by saying, here, let me help you with that, but also let me show you how you can do this next time, but I'm always here for you. So that's an evolving thing. And I think also context matters with the student. Each individual student's at a different place developmentally. And as advisors, we have to recognize that. You know, where is the student? What do they need right now? And that's what we need to try and provide.
Awesome, great responses. And for the record, I still love Grey's Anatomy. So, you know, it can get me into the medical field for this show. All right, so
It's not too late. It's not too late.
Oh, it is great. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Kathe. And Kathe, really want to hear from you and get your perspective on all the things that we have just been sharing today. Where does technology come in, and how can we leverage IT to ensure holistic student success?
Great, thanks for the question, Omari. You know, technology, I think especially in the conversation about advising, can be a tricky conversation.
Sorry, Kathe, is it just me? I believe your sound may have gone out. She can't hear me. Let's see. Okay, she doesn't know. Well, hold on, everyone. Let me see if I can get Kathe to stop.
Helping the management of advising offices, staff.
Okay, you really quick. So you cut out for like a good 24, 25 seconds. So maybe need to go just a little bit. Sorry about that.
Okay. We've learned a lot from technology implementation, and that's kind of where I was going with that. There's lots of different examples of the ways that technologies have been used in advising settings, and there's a couple things that we're learning as a field, which are number one, it's not the technology stupid. It's not the technology as a silver bullet that will solve all of our problems in the advising and student success offices. It's not going to make students magically be able to graduate successfully, but there's a number of factors that really go into successful technology implementation. Just want to do a quick sound check to make sure that I'm rolling okay. Okay. At EDUCAUSE, we've been thinking about the idea of digital transformation, and that really is a stair-step process that is both linear and iterative, that starts with, and the idea behind digital transformation is really the deep and coordinated shifts that are necessary in our culture, our workforce, and our technology that really help us optimize and transform our institutions, both from a strategic perspective, an operational perspective, and really taking a very student-centric view. And so, you know, you heard me say culture, process, and technology, or culture, workforce, and technology. And so as we're working with advising technologies or technologies that support advising practices and advising center management, we really need to understand the deep work that's required in not just plugging in a technology, but also working from the beginning with all of the stakeholders, including frontline advisors, including students, including your academic partners, to understand how technologies might work and how they might fit together, and the so what of the technologies that are being implemented. This change management and leadership, and we've learned from our research looking back at some implementations of technologies, of having a really visible leader that is visible and present and really working across the stakeholder groups to help folks understand their role and how technology might impact them is critical for success and adoption and impact. But just plugging in a technology, even with that change management, is also a process. And one of the things with regard to digital transformation that we see is that there's really a foundational step that happens that we're calling digitization, which is turning things that you might do on paper and pencil or with an Excel document or something that's kind of more basic, and and turning that into something that is now using technology. Those baseline digitization processes are really critical to lay the foundation for the kind of broader transformed experience across an institution with those deep and coordinated shifts. So if you're at early stages of implementing technologies, that's really important, but also it's something that will take patience as you're laying the groundwork for more and more technologies to come in, or for a much more sophisticated use and gradual buy-in and adoption of the technologies, and really understanding what the human element is in those technologies. So again, it's not the technology stupid. The technology is really there to help people talk to each other, to help really optimize and create opportunities for those rich conversations that Chris was describing. And so really making sure that we're kind of using the technology as a tool and not necessarily as a solution. One thing though, as it relates to the technology itself, I'll go back to the, getting the right people together at the right time. You might think that the IT is behind this technology surge and plugging in these technologies. And on your campus, they might have a really central role in this. We're also seeing, though, that oftentimes advising centers are they have the purchasing power. So they're selecting technologies, they're working directly with the vendors, and they're deciding which features to use or not use, and with the best of intentions and having their students and their advising staff in mind. But when IT isn't engaged from the very beginning as a strategic partner, that can lead to an advisor needing 5 screens because the technologies don't talk to one another and they have to use lots of different systems, or the data and the back end not really making sense and not really fitting together. So you can't really get a good story about your students from a data perspective, and whether that's the story that the advisor needs when they're working with that student in the moment, or the story that your IR offices need, or the advising center offices need to be able to make decisions about how interventions or programs or the work that you're doing is working. So having that strategic partnership with your IT office can make your technologies go a long way to ensure those integrations and approach to connecting them. And I'll pass on to the next panelist. Lots more to say, but I think Shauna has some more to as well.
Thanks for that, Kathe. So again, technology is not a silver bullet. The people matter. So that change management aspect is really important. And then also just making sure we're bringing in IT as a strategic partner in the work that can really help bring a lot of the, making sure you're maximizing the use of the technology as a tool. So our last panelist is Shauna. And so Shauna, you have a very unique advantage in which you are able to provide coaching and support to institutions to help them redesign, be more student-centered. So just want to get a sense from you, what are some of the ways institutions have approached this, and what are some of the tools and resources that you have seen be most helpful?
Okay, and I'll just kind of tell you, I don't think that anything that I'm going to say here is going to be, as Kathe just mentioned, it's not as if you put in these 3 simple steps to a universal design for holistic student support, except for a couple of things I'm going to mention. So it's not the same process at every institution, but it does encompass some of the same considerations. And so one of that would be really focusing on institutional capacity. Our organization does a lot of work on capacity building. And I think that institutions right now, especially given the COVID situation, are really, it's really amplifying where there need to be where it needs to be more emphasis on building institutional capacity and also systems within an institution. And so some of my co-panelists have already touched on this in different ways. This idea that I think Jennifer started out with, kind of when we're looking at advising really should be the connective tissue of the institution, right? It should be where information, technology, policy, practice, process, where that intersects. And you have someone who is then interacting with a student and that can be in multiple different ways. But then to help them through a sense making, through kind of building their own skills, and Chris had mentioned that in answering a question, through helping them to kind of self-advocate and to move through the process and on to achieving their goals. But you cannot do that if you don't have strong systems in place. And when I say systems, you know, historically what we have tended to do in higher ed, and I've worked in 4-year and 2-year colleges, is that we tend to kind of work a little bit more by department or school, by unit or division. And so those types of approaches, if there's never been another time that has shown us that what we're going to have to evolve to is really more systems work internally, especially when we have to mobilize and try to respond to kind of situations that require us to kind of have all hands on deck, or to come up with more of a scaled response to students. It's so important that we understand how our systems work, not just technology, but our workflows, our processes, and that's what institutions are doing. They're looking at integrated ways to address the academic needs of students and also the personal needs of students. Just knowing that no one comes to your institution and in the parking lot leaves all of their personal lives and their needs behind. There's no such thing as I come to class and I'm not bringing my life with me. I am. And no matter how brilliant our information is, and no matter how rigorous our programs and services, especially if we are committed as institutions of higher learning, of providing equitable supports and being inclusive of communities that maybe have been traditionally underserved, we need to be aware that people come and bring their whole selves to college. So that's one, you know, understanding how we work, understanding where the gaps are, and then being responsive specifically to those sorts of things, and in particular looking at the intersection between the academic supports as well as the personal supports. And then I think also those institutions who are making gains in this area, they're also designing interventions and supports for the students that they have. So it's this idea of really understanding who your student populations are, what their needs are, and being responsive to those needs. Now that sounds like, well, of course, we should be doing that. And it sounds quite simple, but it's not quite that simple when you start to really chip away at perhaps legacy and tradition and you know, departmental silos or ways in which we've always done things. And again, at this point in time, given what's happening nationally, we've probably never been at a time where we're being pushed so much to really examine that and to see some of those gaps. So some of the things that are most important, if I had to work with an institution right now, I would say one of the first things, there's kind of a immediate response to what the needs are. So some of these institutions, probably some of the practitioners on the line today, you're using low tech and high tech ways to connect to students. I would encourage you to also remember the low tech, especially given the equity conversation about students not having either access to technology or to a device in which they can facilitate some of the things that we're asking them to do. But I would also say looking at ways in which you can integrate more of where they need academic and personal support combined, and where you can utilize the information that you're learning about students and not have that live only in an isolated department or unit at the college, but that can be used to help inform institutional practice all the way around.
Awesome, Shauna. Thank you so much. And thank you all panelists for your thorough responses to our questions. And so we have a few more minutes, and so I want to give an opportunity for the people, our participants, to get their questions answered. So we have a few in the queue. The first one I want to have Jennifer respond to, but the question is, I work in higher ed, but for a high school program. So I have direct contact with high school students. Any thoughts on how I can best support students, especially in a program that is not set up for equity before they get to college?
So, okay, so can you repeat the question? You kind of cut out a little bit there. I'm so sorry. I'm having some technical difficulties.
Sorry. So this one is, I work in higher ed, but for a high school program. So I have direct contact with high school students. Any thoughts on how I can best support students in a program that is not set up for equity before they get to college?
Okay, thank you. I love this question because I think it builds upon the theme we've been talking about, which is that advising sits in this like beautiful sort of liminal space, right? And that has both connective potential within it, the higher education academy, but also between. So what you're talking about is really the potential, the power of transitions. And the high school to college one, we often sort of pretend like we just get them without any kind of background. You know, the minute they step on, they send a message, or they you know, commit or send a message to the institution they're coming. The truth of the matter is that that's a long process, and our colleagues that have been doing that very well have been, you know, admissions and outreach, in terms of being able to do early outreach, connect early on, and I think advising really is the next wave of that. Getting students prepared for the collegiate environment, I think we've been historically very used to sort of saying, well, it's not like high school, but not telling them what it is like, and equipping them and empowering them. So being able to work with those students in a transition space where we're getting them prepared for that jump is really important. And I think a piece of that is really beginning to frame the conversation. I think I'm not sure the panelist is, but if you work for higher ed, but you're in the high school space, you're really able to frame that counseling relationship much more like an advising relationship in preparation for that situation, to empower the students for the kinds of questions they're going to get in an advising relationship when they go there. As for the equity question, that's a bigger one that I feel like our you know, as we look at higher education and K-12 as a sort of P20 pipeline, equity concerns are something that, you know, we see throughout the system, and in some ways our K-12 students are grappling, or colleagues are grappling with this much more. And so I think that starting that conversation in meaningful ways and understanding that it is an ongoing conversation throughout education, throughout life, is a really important piece of it. But I think that you're positioned well to actually be setting a precedent for that students. And I want to applaud you and thank you. And if the way you can frame that is in an advising relationship as opposed to a counseling relationship is really a significant transition point for it. Another place you might look, without going into too much detail here, is really the transfer functionality and the kinds of articulation, matriculation relationships that campuses have in the 2-year and 4-year sector, and the ways that those two are communicating well together is a really good model for how high school and higher ed can be working together.
All right, thanks so much, Jennifer. Our next question will go to Shauna, and the question is, in rural areas, what resources are most essential for career shadowing or educational outreach? Online learning is great, but there is a need for real-world career exploration that lands them a connection to a good job.
Yeah, and so this goes back to the answer that I gave previously, is that I would look at what are the systems within the community. So let's take it from two different ways. If you are a university that is bringing students into a rural community, you may be then sending students outside of that community or back to their home or to some other area for internships or for other types of supports, right? You may be relying more on faculty connections. You may be relying more on particular programs or services on campus in terms of making connections for students that may then be leaving the community to go and practice that career someplace else. If you are a college, a regional college or a 2-year college in which you are serving place-based students, and so those students are going to they're going to benefit from and or be limited by the types of industry that are only available in their community. So they are not there to kind of get the education and leave. They are there to get their education and to stay in the community, to pay taxes in that community, to help build on that community. You really need to be tapping into the system. So whether it's your workforce programs that are there, your small businesses that are there, every community has them. Economic development has resources. Your college probably has a workforce development or continuing education unit that focuses on programs and employer partnerships. One of the things that we often don't do within our colleges when we think about systems, oftentimes our foundation offices are calling on employers, employer partnerships, or those sorts of things. Our workforce units call on employer partnerships. Our faculty have advisory boards or boards that provide information on curriculum, and then we run a career services office someplace else, and they're also calling on employers for those types of resources. Certainly, so what I would say is it doesn't have to be, this is where you really need to look at what are the opportunities in the community, where can small business be a resource. You know, to get experience in a particular industry doesn't mean you have to work for a Fortune 500, right? It means you need to have an opportunity to be exposed to business or industry or whatever that career pipeline is. And especially for those communities that really need some of their students to stay in those communities and practice those skills, I would look to what small businesses are offering. I would look to what your workforce boards are offering, your economic developers, who are they attracting into the community, who's there, and look at also the connections within your college with these different populations. And this is where it would really benefit you to form a really strong internal alliance on connecting to employers and resources, so that students have an opportunity not just to hear us talk about what it is to work in another industry, but for those types of job shadowing or internship or informational interviews, or ways in which they can even meet someone who lives in their community, who does something that they may not even think is possible that they can do. So those are some of the ways, very practical ways, but I think you have to understand your institutional context. And it is very important, I do want to just preface, it's very important in our rural communities that we're not only educating people who are leaving the communities, but we are educating people and making sure they understand the connections and the possibilities to stay in the communities and help build the communities.
Awesome. Thanks, Shauna. We have time for one or two more questions. So the next one is going to go to Chris. And it's, hold on. What are some starting points and tips for first-time advisors having the identity of an incoming student affairs grad as a TA?
Sure. So it's a great question. You know, I did not really know what an academic advisor was until I became one. Because my undergraduate experience, it wasn't part of my experience. So starting out as a new professional in that field, I relied very heavily on colleagues, both within my office, but also across campus. Not to toot our own horn, but I think NACADA is a great resource. The NACADA Clearinghouse is an open source, it's free database of a lot of really great articles, especially for first-time and new advisors. NACADA also has a partnering program. So if there's not someone locally that's doing the work that you want to be doing, or there's not somebody on your campus that you can mentor or identify as a mentor for you as a new advisor, NACADA can certainly help with that. There's a lot of really good literature out there. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is you're going to read a lot of theory, and there's a lot of great value in it. But the most important thing that we all need to do is really honor and recognize where a student is and try and meet them where they are. If you do that, you'll be okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Looks like we ran out of time, so we can't get to everyone's questions, but what we can do is I will have our folks at NASPA give me all the questions, and we will do our best to get back to you with some answers. So if you do have some questions with anything that was said today, please continue to send them, and we will get them sent back out to everyone there. But before we wrap up, just a few moments, just want to say, the folks that you have been hearing from today, from NACADA Achieving the Dream, the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Students in Transition, EDUCAUSE, and ASKU, are all part of the Advising Success Network, in which NASPA is serving as the lead coordinator of all these partners coming together to really, one, clarify and promote what really good advising can look like at different types of institutions, and secondly, be able to develop new resources for the field that can really help institutions meet that ideal state. And so really happy to introduce us formally as a group working together in this space. Our mission is to identify, build, and scale equitable and holistic advising solutions. And with that, we really do have a focus on students of color and low-income students, and making sure that institutions are serving those groups. But our vision is to make sure that all students are are supported through a seamless, personalized, and post-secondary experience. And so we're working together on being able to fulfill this hefty charge, but we have a good group of thought partners and leaders in this space, and happy to be working with them in this. And so if you want to learn more about the Advising Success Network, as well as some of the resources that you can retrieve to understand some of the work that we're doing and just hear what other institutions are doing across the country, we are officially launching the Advising Success Network website. You're the first to hear it, so happy to bring that to you all today. It is www.advisingsuccessnetwork.org. And when you come to this site, you can do a few things. One, be able to learn more about what we're saying are the essential elements or needs for an effective advising redesign, and some of the things and questions that you should be considering in this space. Again, we'll be using this platform as a way to really promote and push all the resources that the network produces, as well as other organizations that are doing great work in this space, so that you can use it as a one-stop shop in addition to NACADA's website and ATD's and the National Resource Center. But this will also be another site for you all to come to pull some of these resources. And you'll also be able to identify different places where the network will be presenting or delivering different technical assistance to institutions that have asked for some additional assistance in supporting their work. And again, one of the things that we want to do is to be able to codify and curate many of the stories that we know that you are doing at your institution. So please, there is a Connect with Us site link on the site. Please give us your information and share your stories. We'll be happy to hear that, as well as keep you up to date with network happenings. All right. So with that, we have 3 minutes to spare, but I want to see if any of my colleagues, panelists, thank them again, but if there's any parting words that they wanted to give in the amount of time that we have left. Good to go.
Omari, I just wanted to say, I think that each of us were having a bit of a back channel chat about the questions we couldn't get to. And so I just want to invite all of the participants that you can reach us directly as well. I think that our contact information is pretty easy to get to with a quick Google search. But so if you have questions that we didn't get to, I know that NASPA is going to be great about corralling those, but I think that all of us each sort of put in the back channel, like, please follow up with us. You know, in the midst of a crazy world of dealing with a lot of other things, this kind of conversation is a bit joyful. So please do reach out. We are happy to talk.
All right. Well, thank you. Oh, sorry. Go on, Shauna.
Yeah, and Omari, I would just add also, you know, thanking everyone for their questions, knowing that there's so many areas in which we all could go really deep and wide for a long time. So we were just we were touching the icing a little bit. We didn't get into all of the components that are in the cake, because that's what I'm thinking about. And we just wanted to thank you, but again, happy to follow up with you to go deep if there's something in particular that you'd really like to know about.
All right. Thanks so much. Again, I echo my panelists of just all your questions, and we, like I said, we will do our best to get back to you. And I'm glad that they extended to, you know, you can reach out to them one-on-one. Don't feel like you have to come through me or anyone else at NASPA to do that. So, but thank you, Shauna, Jackie, Chris, Kathe, Jennifer. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. And I really hope everyone stays safe and in the best spirits possible with everything going on. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.